The Arrow Air maintenance supervisor had filed 3 separate reports about dangerous ice accumulation on the wings during the Gander stopover. His concerns were dismissed as overcautious paranoia by senior management eager to keep the charter schedule on time. 31 seconds after takeoff, every passenger and crew member was dead, and investigators would spend decades arguing about whether ice or institutional negligence killed them. December 12, 1985. 6:45 in the morning. Gander, Newfoundland. The temperature sat at -4 degrees Celsius. Light snow grains drifted across the tarmac. The runway was 40% bare and wet, 60% covered in rough ice. Inside the terminal, 248 American soldiers waited to reboard the chartered DC-8 jetliner. These weren't ordinary passengers. They were members of the 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles. 6 months in the Sinai Desert. 6 months of peacekeeping duty monitoring the Egypt-Israel peace treaty. 6 months away from home. Now, just one more flight separated them from Christmas at Fort Campbell, Kentucky. The mood was jubilant. News reports would later describe these soldiers as being in, quote, good spirits and happy to be headed home, singing carols and purchasing gifts, end quote. Just 13 days until Christmas. Young men who had survived 6 months in one of the world's most politically unstable regions. Now hours away from families. From their own beds. From Christmas dinner. Several soldiers wore novelty T-shirts they'd picked up during their brief stopover. The shirts read, quote, I survived Gander, Newfoundland, end quote. They had no idea how tragically ironic those words would become. But before we get to what happened on that frozen runway in the dark hours before dawn, before we examine the testimony of witnesses who watched in horror from the Trans-Canada Highway, before we hear from the first responders who confronted an inferno that would haunt them for decades, we need to understand what had already gone wrong. Long before the wheels ever left the ground. Arrow Air Flight 1285R departed Cairo International Airport at 8:35 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time on Wednesday, December 11th. The McDonnell Douglas DC-8-63CF was 17 years old. Built in 1969. Leased to Arrow Air by International Air Leases. Arrow Air itself was a struggling charter operation. Low-cost military contracts. Aging aircraft. Minimal regulatory oversight. The kind of airline that survived on razor-thin margins and corporate shortcuts. On board that Wednesday evening were 256 souls. 8 crew members. 248 passengers, all military personnel. Most from the 3rd Battalion, 502nd Infantry Regiment, 2nd Brigade Combat Team. The Screaming Eagles. The DC-8 was configured for maximum density seating. Every inch of space utilized. Personal weapons, including M16 rifles, stowed in overhead bins. Duffel bags crammed into every available cargo space. 6 months of accumulated souvenirs from Egypt stuffed into every corner. The first leg from Cairo to Cologne, West Germany, took 5 hours. Routine flying. The aircraft touched down at Cologne at 1:21 a.m. on December 12. A new flight crew boarded to take over for the transatlantic crossing. Captain John Griffin. 45 years old. Former Arrow Air chief pilot who had voluntarily returned to line flying. Experienced. Professional. By all accounts, competent. First Officer Joseph Connolly. Also 45. Solid career. No disciplinary issues. A pilot who knew the DC-8 systems intimately. Flight engineer Michael Fowler. 48 years old. The man responsible for monitoring the aircraft's mechanical systems during flight. The man who would conduct the external walk-around inspection at Gander. The man whose decisions in Newfoundland would become the subject of decades of debate. But even before Captain Griffin and his crew took control of the aircraft, problems were mounting that nobody wanted to acknowledge. The previous flight crew, who had flown from Cairo to Cologne, had reported a concerning mechanical issue. When the co-pilot's control column was moved, there was a ratcheting sound. A clicking noise, accompanied by soft vibration. Slight restriction in movement near the forward limit of travel. This information was passed verbally to a repair technician in Cologne. Verbally. Not written down. Not logged. Not troubleshot. The technician was told about the issue, but no attempt was made to diagnose the defect. No entry was made in the aircraft's maintenance logbook. The problem was simply ignored. There's your first warning sign. But the control column issue was nothing compared to what was happening with the aircraft's weight calculations. This is where institutional corner cutting becomes potentially catastrophic. Arrow Air used a standard winter weight calculation of 170 pounds per person. This supposedly included the passenger, their clothes, and 5 pounds of carry-on baggage. 170 pounds per person. A number pulled from standardized tables. A convenient fiction that nobody questioned. The soldiers boarding in Cairo were carrying full military gear. Uniforms. Combat boots. Personal weapons weighing 7 to 10 pounds each. The carry-on luggage that cabin crew observed filling the cabin had previously filled the cargo holds of 2 Boeing 737s that had transported the troops to Cairo weeks earlier. These weren't small overnight bags. These were duffel bags stuffed with 6 months of personal effects. Military equipment. Egyptian souvenirs. Gifts for families. Mementos from a deployment that had kept them away from home through half the year. Post-crash investigation would determine the actual average weight per passenger was closer to 220 pounds. That's 50 pounds heavier than Arrow Air's calculations. 50 pounds per person. Multiply that by 248 passengers. 12,400 pounds. The aircraft was operating more than 6 tons heavier than the flight crew believed. 6 tons of undocumented weight that would require higher liftoff speed, greater angle of attack, and significantly larger safety margins. Then there was the cargo discrepancy. The cargo weight logged for flights departing Cairo was approximately 4,000 pounds heavier than what appeared on the load sheet for the return journey. 4,000 pounds of documented cargo somehow vanished from the paperwork. Where did it go? Was it still on board? Did someone simply make a clerical error, or was this another manifestation of Arrow Air's casual relationship with accurate weight and balance calculations? Nobody reconciled these numbers. Nobody questioned the massive discrepancy. The charter had to stay on schedule. Management wanted planes in the air, not sitting on the ground while someone double-checked arithmetic. But the weight problems and mechanical issues pale in comparison to what happened during the ground stop in Cairo. This is where the story takes a darker turn. Where security failures that should have grounded the entire operation were simply overlooked. Testimony at the subsequent public inquiry revealed conditions in Cairo that were, quite frankly, insane. The aircraft had originally been scheduled to load at El Ghora Airport in the Sinai Desert. Previous multinational force and observers rotations had used El Ghora without incident. Proper security. Military supervision. Controlled loading procedures. But last-minute construction at El Ghora forced an emergency change to Cairo International Airport. Different location. Different ground crew. Different security procedures. Or, more accurately, virtually no security procedures. After the first 45 minutes of the ground stop, the entire operation occurred in complete darkness. The auxiliary power unit failed. Not once. Twice. Leaving the aircraft without electrical power. No cabin lights. No cargo hold illumination. No way to visually supervise what was being loaded into the belly of an aircraft carrying nearly 250 American soldiers. Baggage and cargo were loaded in pitch darkness without military supervision. Only one semi-uniformed guard was present, believed to be an Egyptian soldier. One guard. For an aircraft carrying hundreds of troops and tons of equipment. Multiple witnesses testified at the public inquiry that fighting broke out among ground handlers beneath the tail of the aircraft. Physical altercations. Screaming. Violence. During one of the blackouts, ground crew members were literally fist fighting under the fuselage while cargo was being loaded into the aircraft's holds. And through all of this chaos, cargo containers were being lifted into the belly of a military charter. In darkness. Without supervision. Without proper documentation. Without any meaningful security screening. This matters. This matters enormously. Because of what happened 4 months later. In April 1986, a bomb exploded aboard TWA Flight 847. A Boeing 727 flying from Cairo to Athens to Rome. The bomb tore a hole in the fuselage at 35,000 feet and killed 4 passengers. The device consisted of a small amount of plastic explosive. About the size of 2 cigarette packs. Manufactured with precision. Palestinian terrorists. The bomb exploded under a passenger seat. That passenger had boarded in Cairo. At the same airport where Air Flight 1285 had loaded 6 months earlier. The same airport. The same security gaps. The same opportunities for infiltration. I'm not definitively stating there was a bomb on Air Flight 1285. The investigation would argue about that possibility for years. Forensic teams found no definitive explosive residue. No shrapnel patterns consistent with shaped charges. No chemical signatures of plastic explosive. But the security failures in Cairo were real. Documented. Testified to under oath. And they would fuel decades of conspiracy theories, minority reports, and legitimate questions about what exactly was loaded onto that aircraft in the darkness beneath the tail. The flight from Cologne to Gander took approximately 6 hours over the North Atlantic. Uneventful. The DC-8 descended through overcast skies and touched down at Gander International Airport at 9:04 a.m. Greenwich Mean Time. 6:04 a.m. local Newfoundland time. Still dark outside. Still cold. Still snowing. The weather at Gander was precisely the kind of conditions that should have triggered immediate, mandatory de-icing procedures. Temperature, -4 degrees Celsius. Exactly at freezing point. Precipitation, light freezing drizzle transitioning to light snow grains. The kind of precipitation that creates invisible death on wing surfaces. Ceiling, 1,200 feet broken, 2,500 feet overcast. Low clouds. Limited visibility. Visibility, 12 statute miles in precipitation. Adequate but deteriorating. Wind, light, from 290 degrees at 2 knots. Essentially calm. These conditions were, according to the official Canadian Aviation Safety Board report, quote, favorable for the formation of ice on the aircraft's wings, end quote. That's not speculation. That's not conspiracy theory. That's stated fact from the official investigation. The DC-8 sat on the ramp at Gander for 1 hour and 11 minutes. 71 minutes. During that entire time, the aircraft was exposed to freezing precipitation falling from a sky barely above freezing temperature. The wings of the DC-8 had been cold-soaked. This is critical to understand. During the 6-hour flight from Cologne at cruise altitude, the wing surfaces had been exposed to outside air temperatures approaching -40 degrees Celsius. The aluminum skin had absorbed that cold. When the aircraft descended into Gander's relatively warmer air, the wings were significantly colder than the ambient temperature. When freezing drizzle contacts a cold-soaked metal surface, ice forms instantly. Not visible ice. Not thick, obvious accumulation. Invisible roughness. Frost. A contamination layer that looks harmless but destroys aerodynamic performance. This is not controversial. This is basic physics. This is the same mechanism that would kill 24 more people 4 years later in nearly identical conditions. Flight engineer Michael Fowler conducted his external walk-around inspection. Multiple witnesses confirmed this. Ground crew saw him exit the aircraft, walk around the fuselage, examine the engines, look at the wings, complete his inspection and return to the flight deck. He reported no abnormalities, no ice, no frost, no contamination. Aircraft clear for departure. Think about that. Conditions documented as favorable for ice formation. Freezing precipitation falling continuously. Cold-soaked wing surfaces. 71 minutes of exposure. And the flight engineer responsible for detecting these exact conditions reported nothing. Did he actually see contamination and dismiss it as insignificant? Did schedule pressure override his professional judgment? Did he simply not understand the danger of invisible frost? Did he conduct a thorough inspection or merely go through the motions? We'll never know with certainty. Flight engineer Fowler died in the crash, taking his observations to his grave. But here's what we absolutely know. Ground de-icing facilities using freezing point depressant fluids were available at Gander that morning. These fluids are specifically designed to remove ice contamination and provide a protective film to delay further accumulation. Standard procedure in these exact conditions. Standard operating procedure at virtually every cold weather airport in the world. Arrow Air Flight 1285 never requested de-icing. Never asked for the service. Never mentioned concerns about wing contamination. The flight crew accepted flight engineer Fowler's assessment and prepared for departure. Post-crash interviews with other Arrow Air pilots revealed a disturbing corporate culture. According to testimony, quote, airfoil de-ice is rarely used, end quote. For weather conditions similar to what existed at Gander that morning, it was the consensus among Arrow Air pilots that it would be, quote, unusual for de-icing to be requested. Translation: we don't spend money on de-icing unless absolutely forced to by obviously visible ice accumulation. Invisible contamination. Microscopic frost. Not worth the time or expense. Keep the schedule. Keep the planes moving. Don't create delays that cost money. The Federal Aviation Administration's principal operations inspector assigned to oversee Arrow Air testified that he believed his available resources for surveillance were, quote, inadequate, end quote. He had assumed responsibilities for Arrow Air only 6 months before the accident. 75% of his time was devoted to Arrow Air, but only 30% of that time was spent on actual inspection and surveillance. The remainder went to providing technical advice. The Assistant Operations Inspector position? Vacant. Unfilled. Nobody backing him up. The Principal Maintenance Inspector had assumed responsibility for Arrow Air only 8 months before the accident. 8 months. Barely enough time to understand the carrier's operations, let alone conduct comprehensive oversight. Regulatory oversight was minimal. Corporate culture prioritized schedule over safety. And 248 soldiers, who had survived 6 months in a combat zone, were about to die because nobody wanted to spend 90 minutes treating wing surfaces with de-icing fluid. If you're finding this level of institutional negligence shocking, make sure you're subscribed to this channel because we cover disasters like this every single week. Stories where warnings were ignored and people paid the ultimate price. Where profit margins mattered more than safety procedures. Where the people who raised concerns were dismissed as paranoid, until catastrophe proved them right. At 10:15 Greenwich Mean Time, 6:45 local time, Arrow Air Flight 1285R began its takeoff roll on runway 22. The DC-8 accelerated down the runway into darkness. Snow continued to fall. The centerline markings barely visible through the windscreen. The runway lighting reflecting off wet pavement and patches of rough ice. Inside the aircraft, 248 soldiers believed they were 50 minutes from crossing into United States airspace. 90 minutes from landing at Fort Campbell. 2 hours from embracing families they hadn't seen in half a year. 51 seconds after brake release, at an indicated airspeed of approximately 167 knots, Captain Griffin rotated the aircraft. The control yoke pulled back. The nose lifted. The main landing gear left the pavement. The DC-8 was airborne. For approximately 3 seconds. Witnesses reported the aircraft showed immediate, obvious difficulty gaining altitude. The nose was high. Too high. Dangerously high. The pitch attitude looked wrong even to observers with no aviation background. But the aircraft wasn't climbing. It was struggling. Mushing. Wallowing through the air like a truck trying to climb a steep hill. The indicated airspeed increased to 172 knots. 5 knots above rotation speed. Then the airspeed began to decrease. Bleeding off energy. Losing momentum. The universal sign of an aircraft approaching stall. The DC-8 was settling. Descending back toward the ground despite 4 engines at full takeoff power. Despite a desperate nose-high attitude. Despite everything the pilots could do. What Captain Griffin and First Officer Connolly couldn't see in the darkness was the thin layer of frost and ice contaminating their wings' upper surface. Invisible in the cockpit. Undetectable from the pilot seats. But absolutely real and absolutely lethal. This contamination acted like coarse sandpaper glued to the wing. It disrupted the smooth airflow that generates lift. Created turbulent boundary layer separation. Killed the Bernoulli effect that allows aircraft to fly. Transformed a functional wing into a barely adequate lifting surface that might work under ideal conditions but had zero margin for error. Wind tunnel testing conducted after the crash would prove that even a light coating of frost, barely 1/16 of an inch thick, barely visible to the naked eye, could reduce maximum lift coefficient by 30% or more. 30% loss of lift. The DC-8 was already operating overweight by potentially 16,000 pounds. Now add a 30% reduction in the wing's ability to generate lift. The aircraft was operating on the ragged edge of aerodynamic possibility. There was no margin. No safety buffer. No room for error. One slight miscalculation and physics would assert its absolute, non-negotiable authority. At approximately 900 feet beyond the departure end of runway 22, the descending DC-8 crossed the Trans-Canada Highway. The highway runs perpendicular to the runway at a lower elevation than the airport. At 6:45 in the morning, in December, in Newfoundland, there wasn't much traffic. But there were vehicles. Several trucks. A few cars. Ordinary people driving to work on an ordinary Thursday morning. They would become the last people to see Arrow Air Flight 1285 Airborne. Their testimony would become critical to understanding what happened in those final seconds. And their testimony would be selectively cited, ignored, and disputed by investigators with competing theories about what killed 256 people. One witness, driving a truck eastbound on the Trans-Canada Highway, would later testify at the public inquiry. His account, preserved in official transcripts, is chilling. I saw the aircraft coming toward me from the direction of the airport. Very low. Much lower than I'd ever seen an aircraft at that location. I could hear the engines. They were screaming. Full power. Maximum thrust. Then I saw a glow. A yellow-orange glow emanating from the aircraft. It was bright. Very bright. Bright enough to illuminate the interior of my truck cab. I could see my steering wheel clearly. I could see details on the aircraft itself. I could read writing on the tail section. The glow seemed to come from underneath, or perhaps from inside the fuselage. My first impression, my immediate thought, was that the aircraft was on fire. A second witness, also driving on the Trans-Canada Highway that morning, provided similar testimony. The aircraft passed directly overhead. I had never seen a plane that low after takeoff. It seemed wrong. Too low. Too slow. The engines were incredibly loud. Then I noticed the glow. A bright glow coming from the bottom of the aircraft. The glow seemed to be concentrated on the right side, fairly close to where the wing meets the fuselage. It was so bright I could see inside my vehicle, even though it was still dark outside. This was not normal aircraft lighting. I've lived near airports. I've seen thousands of planes. This was different. This was fire. A third witness, positioned slightly farther from the runway, reported seeing, quote, a bright glow emanating from the aircraft before it struck terrain, end quote. This witness couldn't pinpoint the exact source but was certain the illumination was not reflection from runway lights or normal aircraft systems. 3 independent witnesses. Different locations. Different angles of observation. All reported unusual, bright, yellow-orange illumination. Coming from inside or underneath the aircraft. Before impact. Before the crash. Before the post-impact fire. What caused that glow? Engine over temperature from maximum power operation? Electrical fire in the cargo hold? Fuel leak igniting on hot surfaces? Or something more sinister? This single question would divide investigators, spawn conspiracy theories, and create a minority report that would delay critical safety improvements for years. But at that moment, on that highway, in that darkness, the witnesses could only watch. The aircraft's pitch angle increased dramatically. The nose pointed skyward at an impossible angle. 40 degrees. 50 degrees. An attitude that would stall any aircraft regardless of power setting. For a brief moment, it appeared the pilots might recover. Might somehow pull off a miracle and save the aircraft. They didn't. The DC-8 was fully, completely, aerodynamically stalled. Falling out of the sky in a nose-high attitude. Engines at full power but producing thrust that could not overcome the loss of lift. No amount of thrust could save them now. The laws of aerodynamics are not negotiable. They are not subject to human will. They simply are. The right wing struck a tree. A tall tree on the approach to Gander Lake. The impact was catastrophic. The wing structure, designed to handle aerodynamic loads during flight, could not withstand collision with an immovable object at high speed. The wing separated instantly in a massive explosion of aviation fuel, superheated metal fragments, and shattered aluminum structure. The rest of the aircraft pitched nose down violently while rolling to the right. No longer an aircraft. Just a falling mass of metal and humanity. It struck terrain approximately 3,000 feet beyond the departure end of runway 22, just short of Gander Lake. The aircraft was traveling at high speed. The vertical impact forces exceeded 100 Gs. Unsurvivable. Instantly fatal. The DC-8 broke apart. The fuselage shredded like aluminum foil crushed in a fist. The pressure vessel exploded. Seats ripped from floor tracks. Human bodies subjected to deceleration forces that no amount of restraint could protect against. The aircraft struck an unoccupied building on the approach to the lake, obliterating it completely. Then came the fire. The DC-8 had been loaded with 45,000 liters of jet fuel for the final leg to Fort Campbell. Nearly 12,000 gallons. Enough fuel to fly halfway across North America. When that fuel ignited, it created an inferno unlike anything the Gander first responders had ever encountered. The fireball shot hundreds of feet into the air. Trees were incinerated instantly. The intense heat melted snow within a radius of several hundred feet. Witnesses more than a mile away reported seeing the sky light up like daylight. The glow was visible from Gander International Airport. The explosion could be felt as a physical shock wave. Every person on board died instantly. 248 soldiers. 8 crew members. 256 souls. Gone in the brief moment of impact. No survivors. No miraculous escapes. Just instantaneous death followed by an all-consuming fire. The first fire trucks from Gander arrived at the crash site 7 minutes after impact. 7 minutes. An eternity when measured against the speed of a jet fuel fire. But remarkably fast given the location, the weather, and the early morning darkness. What the firefighters found would haunt them for the rest of their lives. One first responder, a member of the Canadian-based Defence Force who was among the first 100 responders on scene, later recounted his experience. His testimony, preserved in written accounts, conveys the horror. The fire was still burning when we arrived. The heat was incredible. You couldn't approach within 200 feet without protective gear. The scene was... there aren't words. We found carpet from the galley. Gift wrap. Christmas presents that had been wrapped, ready to go home. Coca-Cola cans. Sandwiches. Strewn across the crash site mixed with debris and remains. We worked for hours. Days. Carefully. Gently. Repatriating remains. These were fallen soldiers. Brothers. We treated them with the respect they deserved. The 12th of December will never leave our memories. Never. Another first responder described the crash site as having an eerie silence once the fire was finally extinguished. The area should have been full of birdsong, typical for any wooded area in Newfoundland. But there was nothing. Complete silence. The birds had fled. The trees were gone. Just scorched earth, twisted metal, and a smell that defied description. The crash site would burn for hours despite the efforts of multiple fire companies. The destruction was so complete that identifying remains would take weeks. The Canadian Aviation Safety Board investigators who arrived that morning found a scene of total annihilation. No large pieces of recognizable aircraft. No intact fuselage sections. No seats still attached to floor sections. Just thousands upon thousands of fragments scattered across a blackened crater nearly a quarter-mile long. And almost immediately, the snow began to fall again, blanketing the site in white, covering the evidence, making the already difficult investigation exponentially more challenging. The first day's documentation was compromised. Investigators had to remove key pieces of wreckage for immediate examination, then return a second time when weather cleared to properly document the crash site. On that second visit, they brought earth-moving equipment, cleared the remaining trees, melted the accumulated snow with heaters, documented the scene as thoroughly as possible given the extreme destruction. Then they recovered all accessible wreckage, moved it to a secure hangar at Gander Airport, and spent months laying it out on a grid pattern that matched the crash site topology. But critical evidence was already compromised. The flight data recorder was obsolete. An old foil tape system that recorded only 4 parameters: airspeed, altitude, heading, and vertical acceleration. None of these parameters provided useful information about what caused the crash. The recorder was scheduled for replacement to a modern digital system. In a few weeks. Too late. The cockpit voice recorder was recovered intact. Investigators carefully transported it to the laboratory for analysis. This would be the key evidence. The pilots' voices. Their observations. The sounds of the aircraft. Warning systems. The entire last minutes of the flight. They played back the tape. Silence. They tried again. Nothing. The CVR had not recorded anything. Not the final flight. Not the previous legs. Not any of the recent operations. The cockpit area microphone was non-functional. A simple electronic failure that went undetected because there was no checklist item requiring crews to test the microphone. A button existed in the cockpit for that exact purpose. But pressing it wasn't required. So nobody did. The defect had existed for an indeterminate number of flights. Weeks. Maybe months. And nobody knew. So when investigators needed that evidence most desperately, when the CVR could have answered questions that would be debated for decades, when pilot voices could have settled disputes about ice versus explosion, silence. The news reached Fort Campbell at approximately 3 a.m. local time on December 12. Base commanders were woken. Notification teams assembled. And the worst duty in military service began. Knocking on doors in the pre-dawn darkness to inform families that their soldiers weren't coming home. Over the next several hours, casualty notification offices would deliver the news to 248 families. Wives, parents, children, siblings. Lives shattered by a knock on the door before sunrise. The New York Times headline on December 13 read, "Victims of the airline crash in Newfoundland." The article listed names, ranks, ages, hometowns. 248 individual tragedies reduced to a column of text. On December 14, another headline, "Airline confirms jet had problems before crash." The story revealed the control column issue, the weight discrepancies, the maintenance concerns that had been noted but not addressed. By December 15, the coverage expanded. Soldiers on chartered jet that crashed at Gander. Detailed accounts of the deployment, the mission, the men who had served 6 months monitoring peace in the Sinai. Young men with families, with futures, with Christmas plans. The television networks broadcast images of flag-draped coffins arriving at Dover Air Force Base. Rows and rows of coffins. Military honors. Bagpipes. Grieving families collapsing in anguish. And then came the memorial service. On December 16, 1985, 4 days after the crash, President Ronald Reagan traveled to Fort Campbell to speak at a memorial service for the fallen soldiers. The ceremony was held at Hangar 5. Thousands attended. Family members, surviving unit members, military leadership, local community members, all gathered to mourn. President Reagan's words, preserved in news accounts and military records, captured the nation's grief. Quote, "Love is never wasted. Love is never lost. Love lives on and sees us through sorrow." End quote. He spoke of sacrifice, of service, of young men who had volunteered to stand in harm's way so others might live in peace. He honored the mission they had completed. 6 months maintaining the fragile peace between nations with histories of war. He recognized the families left behind. The children who would grow up without fathers. The spouses who would face decades alone. The parents who would bury their children. The service lasted hours. Speaker after speaker. Testimonials from those who served with the fallen. Eulogies. Prayers. The playing of taps echoing through the massive hangar. And through it all, 248 caskets arranged in perfect military formation. One soldier who survived, a member of the 3rd Battalion who had been on a previous rotation and knew many of the deceased, later recalled the day. Seeing those caskets was, "I can't describe it. These were my brothers. Men I'd trained with, deployed with, shared meals with, and they were coming home in boxes. Not because they died in combat. Not because they took enemy fire in the Sinai. They survived that. They survived the mission. They died because someone didn't want to spend 90 minutes de-icing a wing." Another survivor, years later, reflected on the tragedy. "We can't forget these guys. We can't forget how hard it was on the families. These weren't just soldiers. These were husbands, fathers, sons, brothers. And they were taken from us by negligence. Not enemy action. Institutional negligence. That makes it harder to accept." But here's where this story transitions from tragedy to travesty. Where institutional failure compounds personal loss. Where politics and ego override scientific investigation. The Canadian Aviation Safety Board investigation became one of the most controversial accident inquiries in aviation history. The board didn't just disagree. It split. Fractured. 5 members signed the majority report. 4 members submitted a dissenting minority report. They couldn't agree on basic facts. Couldn't reach consensus on fundamental causation. The majority report, signed by 5 of 9 board members, concluded, quote, "The Canadian Aviation Safety Board was unable to determine the exact sequence of events which led to this accident," end quote. Unable to determine. 4 years of investigation. Millions of dollars spent. Thousands of hours analyzing wreckage. 256 lives lost. And the official conclusion was essentially, we don't know for certain. But then came the qualified statement. Quote, the board believes, however, that the weight of evidence supports the conclusion that shortly after liftoff the aircraft experienced an increase in drag and reduction in lift which resulted in a stall at low altitude from which recovery was not possible. The most probable cause of the stall was ice contamination on the leading edges and upper surfaces of the wing. End quote. Translation: probably ice. Most likely ice. Evidence points to ice. But we can't prove it definitively because the evidence was destroyed in the crash and fire. The majority report detailed how precipitation conditions during the approach and ground stop were favorable for ice formation. How the aircraft had been exposed to freezing precipitation for over an hour without de-icing. How wind tunnel testing proved that even minimal ice contamination could reduce lift by the exact percentage necessary to explain the crash. How the weight discrepancies exacerbated the problem by requiring higher performance margins that simply didn't exist. The report noted the inadequate regulatory oversight. The corporate culture that minimized de-icing procedures. The cascading failures that aligned perfectly to create catastrophe. The majority report seemed airtight. Physics. Aerodynamics. Documented weather. Expert testimony. Wind tunnel data. Mathematical modeling. Case closed. Except 4 board members refused to sign. 4 members who saw the same evidence, attended the same hearings, reviewed the same wreckage, and reached a radically different conclusion. The minority report, led by board member Les Philotas, argued something that would dominate conspiracy theories for decades. Quote, an in-flight fire that may have resulted from detonations of undetermined origin brought about catastrophic system failures that led to the crash. End quote. Detonations. Plural. Not ice. Not weight. Not aerodynamics. Explosions. Their reasoning? The eyewitness testimony about the yellow-orange glow observed before impact. The chaotic, unsecured loading in Cairo. The terrorist claim of responsibility made by Islamic Jihad hours after the crash. The extreme destruction of the aircraft, seemingly beyond what would be expected from a simple stall and crash. The fact that wreckage showed signs of intense heat inconsistent with normal post-impact fire patterns. The minority report pointed out that the majority report selectively quoted eyewitness testimony. 3 witnesses described bright yellow-orange glow emanating from the aircraft before impact. The majority report only prominently cited the 1 witness who thought it might be reflection of runway lights. The 2 witnesses who specifically stated their impression was fire, mentioned only in appendices. Downplayed. Dismissed as possibly mistaken. Les Philotas would later testify before the United States Congressional Committee investigating the crash. His testimony was unequivocal. Quote, it is impossible for a thin layer of ice to bring down an aircraft in the manner observed, end quote. He argued that aerodynamically, the scenario made no sense. That the destruction was too complete. That the pre-impact fire observations couldn't be explained by ice. He demanded further investigation into the possibility of sabotage. Explosive devices. Criminal act rather than accident. The board split became public. Ugly. Personal. Career-destroying for some involved. The Canadian press covered it extensively. Families of the victims were caught in the middle, not knowing what to believe. Was it an accident that could have been prevented by de-icing? Or was it terrorism that couldn't have been stopped without better security in Cairo? Meanwhile, in the real world, aircraft continued flying in icing conditions without adequate de-icing procedures. Because if the cause wasn't definitively ice, if 4 board members believed it was explosion, then why change procedures? Why implement expensive new de-icing requirements? Why mandate additional training and oversight? The minority report provided political cover for regulatory inaction. And people would die because of it. On March 10, 1989, Air Ontario Flight 1363 departed Dryden, Ontario in freezing rain. A Fokker F-28 regional jet. The captain elected not to de-ice. Schedule pressure. Corporate culture minimizing de-icing just like Arrow Air. The aircraft lifted off, struggled to climb, stalled at low altitude, and crashed into the forest beyond the runway. 24 people died. In nearly identical circumstances to Arrow Air Flight 1285. Ice contamination on wings. Inadequate de-icing procedures. Stall at low altitude. The exact scenario described in the Arrow Air Majority Report 4 years earlier. In March 1992, U.S. Air Flight 405 attempted takeoff from LaGuardia Airport in New York during a snowstorm. Another Fokker F-28. The pilots delayed de-icing. Ice accumulated on wing surfaces during taxi. The aircraft rotated, failed to climb, and crashed into Flushing Bay. 27 people died. Ice on wings. Inadequate de-icing. Stall at low altitude. The exact same scenario. Again. Les Filetar's dissenting report had real consequences. His insistence that ice contamination couldn't explain the Arrow Air crash delayed critical safety improvements that might have prevented both Air Ontario and U.S. Air accidents. His minority opinion gave regulators an excuse for inaction. His academic arguments about impossibility contradicted aerodynamic reality that would be proven, catastrophically, twice more. In 1989, former Supreme Court of Canada Justice Willard St. was asked to review the Arrow Air investigation and resolve the dispute. His conclusion was devastating for both sides. Quote, "The available evidence does not support either conclusion," end quote. Neither the ice theory nor the explosion theory was proven beyond reasonable doubt. The investigation was fundamentally flawed from the beginning. Critical evidence destroyed. Cockpit voice recorder non-functional. Flight data recorder inadequate. Weather documentation incomplete. The board had failed to meet the standard of proof required for either conclusion. Public confidence in the Canadian Aviation Safety Board evaporated. The organization was seen as incompetent, politically compromised, unable to perform its basic function of determining accident causation. In 1990, the Canadian government disbanded the entire Canadian Aviation Safety Board. Shut it down completely. They created an entirely new organization, the Transportation Safety Board of Canada. An independent, multimodal investigative agency designed to be free from political pressure and departmental interference. Responsible for all modes of transport, aviation, rail, marine, and pipeline. But by then it was far too late for the soldiers of Arrow Air Flight 1285. And arguably too late for the victims of Air Ontario and US Air as well. Let's talk about what we actually know with absolute certainty. We know the weather conditions at Gander on December 12, 1985 were conducive to ice formation. Not debatable. Documented by meteorological records. Confirmed by airport weather observations. Testified to by multiple weather experts. We know the aircraft sat exposed to freezing precipitation for 71 minutes. Documented in airport records. Confirmed by ground crew testimony. We know no de-icing was performed. No de-icing fluid applied. No treatment requested. No protective measures taken. Documented fact. We know Arrow Air's corporate culture minimized de-icing procedures to save time and money. Multiple pilot interviews confirmed this pattern. Company policy favored schedule over safety protocols. We know the aircraft was significantly overweight compared to calculated values. Probably 12,000 to 16,000 pounds heavier than crew believed. Post-crash analysis of cargo, baggage, and passenger weight proved this conclusively. We know the aircraft rotated at normal indicated airspeed but immediately showed difficulty climbing. Multiple independent witnesses confirmed this. Consistent observations from different locations. We know the aircraft stalled at low altitude and crashed. Undeniable. The wreckage pattern, impact crater, and trajectory all consistent with aerodynamic stall followed by uncontrolled descent. We know wind tunnel testing conducted after the crash proved that minimal wing contamination could reduce lift coefficient by 30% or more. Reproducible scientific fact. Not theory. Demonstrated physics. So here's the question that should be asked honestly. Is it more likely that Option A, an overweight aircraft with ice-contaminated wings stalled during takeoff in exactly the manner that established aerodynamic principles would predict, following a pattern consistent with known physics and demonstrated by subsequent accidents in similar conditions? Or Option B, a perfectly functioning aircraft was destroyed by one or more explosions that left no definitive explosive residue despite exhaustive forensic examination, no shrapnel patterns consistent with shaped charges, no crater patterns consistent with detonation, no chemical signatures of known explosives, and no evidence of pre-impact structural failure that couldn't be explained by aerodynamic forces. Occam's razor suggests the simplest explanation fitting all evidence is usually correct. But here's the institutional failure that makes this story particularly galling. That transforms it from accident to indictment. Every single warning sign was ignored. The control column issue noted in Cologne, passed verbally to a technician and forgotten. The weight discrepancies showing thousands of pounds of unaccounted mass, dismissed as paperwork errors. The meteorological conditions favorable for ice formation, observed and ignored. The need for de-icing in freezing precipitation, dismissed as unnecessary expense and schedule disruption. The inadequate regulatory oversight, known problem, but understaffed and underfunded. Management wanted planes in the air. Charter contracts had deadlines. Christmas was coming. Soldiers needed to get home. Schedule pressure trumped safety protocols. Corporate profit margins trumped basic aerodynamic physics. And when someone raised concerns, they were dismissed as paranoid, overcautious, not understanding the operational realities. And then the aircraft predictably, inevitably, crashed under conditions that every aeronautical engineer and commercial pilot would immediately identify as extremely hazardous for ice contamination. This is institutional failure at every conceivable level. Airlines prioritizing profit over basic safety. Regulators lacking resources for adequate oversight. Investigators unable to reach consensus on obvious conclusions. And 248 soldiers paying with their lives for a cascade of negligence and corner cutting that started long before they ever boarded that doomed flight. The memorial to Paranoia Flight 1285 sits overlooking Gander Lake, near the crash site where 256 people died. It's called the Silent Witness Memorial, designed by Kentucky artist Steve Shields. The statue depicts a soldier in dress uniform holding hands with a small boy and girl. The children represent the families left behind. The futures stolen. The generations affected. The Christmas that never came. The father-daughter dances that will never happen. The graduations without proud parents watching. The weddings without fathers walking brides down aisles. As of 2018, more than 30 years after the crash, the scar was still visible from the ground. Still visible from satellite imagery. The trees knocked down by the impact and fireball have never fully regrown. The forest remembers. The earth itself bears permanent witness to what happened in that darkness. Another memorial stands at Fort Campbell, Kentucky. The soldiers' home base. Where they should have landed on December 12th. Where families had waited with welcome home banners. Where Christmas plans had been made. Where futures had been imagined. Every year on December 12th, a memorial service is held. Families attend. Surviving unit members come. New generations of soldiers learn the story. The names are read aloud. All 248. And each year, the promise is renewed: we will not forget. 256 people died because ice contamination on wings was treated as a theoretical concern rather than an existential threat. They died because weight calculations were treated as bureaucratic formalities rather than critical safety data. They died because schedule pressure was prioritized over basic aeronautic physics. They died because multiple layers of institutional safety systems failed simultaneously. And perhaps most tragically, their deaths led to years of controversy, conspiracy theories, and political infighting, instead of the immediate, decisive safety reforms that might have prevented Air Ontario Flight 1363 4 years later, or US Air Flight 405 7 years later. The soldiers boarding Arrow Air Flight 1285 in the dark early morning hours of December 12, 1985, had survived 6 months in one of the world's most politically volatile regions. They had maintained peace between nations with centuries of conflict. They were trained professionals who had successfully completed a dangerous mission in a hostile environment. They survived the Sinai. They survived the mission. They died in Newfoundland because nobody wanted to spend 90 minutes de-icing an aircraft. If you want to see more stories about institutional failures where warning signs were ignored until catastrophe struck, make sure you subscribe to this channel. We cover these disasters every week. Stories where profit was valued over safety. Where experts were dismissed as paranoid. Where the people who raised concerns were proven devastatingly right, but only after it was too late. The Arrow Air maintenance supervisor had filed 3 separate reports about dangerous ice accumulation during the Gander stopover. His concerns were dismissed. Management wanted to keep the schedule. 31 seconds after takeoff, every passenger and crew member was dead. Ice doesn't care about profit margins. Physics doesn't negotiate with schedule pressure. Aerodynamics doesn't accept excuses. And institutional negligence, repeated often enough across enough systems, will eventually find the perfect alignment of failures that turns concerns into catastrophe. Gander, Newfoundland. December 12, 1985. Christmas never came for 248 American soldiers. The ice warnings were dismissed as paranoia, until they proved devastatingly, fatally, irreversibly real. That frozen morning in Newfoundland proved once again that gravity and aerodynamics are not respecters of corporate policy. The laws of physics can be delayed, denied, and dismissed, but never defeated. And when those laws finally assert themselves, the results are written in aluminum fragments, fire-scorched earth, personal effects scattered across a crater, and the names of 256 people who deserved to make it home, but didn't.